forcing parallelism. This can be useful in performance-sensitive environments. This is work. This is not a simple thing all the time. So if we have query store, this actually can be kind of simple, though. So this isn't always hard. But the question is, if a query is under cost threshold, can you make it go parallel? This may be useful in some situations. You might think, why would I ever want to have to do this? Well, so imagine I've got, a very critical SQL Server instance, performance matters, and there is a mixed workload on it. This used to be something that people hated. And maybe people do still hate it, but it's just a fact of life, because often now our customers want information on how many products have been sold, or how different stock is doing, or they want information right now. They want real-time information, and they are simply not willing to wait for an ETL process to run, and our competitors might let them see the information right away. So why are we saying, oh, you only get data 12 hours after it's happening? It's really a tough situation now, and now more and more, we have small inserts, updates, and deletes happening against the same SQL Server instance, where we have some queries who scan and aggregate data against those tables. We have more of a report. We have a mixed reporting and OLTP environment. Sometimes we're able to offload some of the reporting with technologies like readable secondaries, but we are not always able to do that depending on what's going on. So we have a lot of tools in our tools box with isolation levels and secondaries, but a lot of times we do have mixes of these queries. It may be true that a high threshold for parallelism is great for almost my entire workload, but right after, I'm testing things and it looks good, and I figure out I'm going to raise my cost threshold. And most queries, after I raise my cost threshold, most queries are the same speed. They're just performing fine. But I've got a couple of queries who get slower, and they're frequent, important queries. Do I just want to, if it's good for most of my workload, it might be convenient to leave my cost threshold at the higher level. And then for those queries who aren't going parallel because they're below the cost threshold, do something to make them go parallel. So let's take a look at options that we have. Our options are they've gotten better for this in recent versions of SQL Server. This is in the file Forcing Parallelism. So we'll go ahead and open that file. We're going to actually open the next two. We'll open 3 and 4, and then we'll close number 2 there. Forcing Parallelism, I'm going to go ahead and set my SP configure way high. This is the maximum value you can set for cost threshold. There should be an S in there. Threshold. Management Studio doesn't offer me spell check. Why is that? Setting it to 32,767. And by the way, this is just a little tidbit. I think I learned this from Kaylin Delaney. If you don't have to view the values. If I just want to know the values for cost threshold, I don't have to put in all the words. I can just say cost threshold, and it will return anything that has that value in it. So if I just do cost, there's going to be more than one. And it does give me an error. It says it's not unique, but then it also tells me what they are. So if I'm just kind of lazy and I don't want to type them all, I can use that to then populate it and get back the thing. But if I just use enough words that I get only one thing back, I actually can see it without typing the whole thing in there. And I can see that it is at the maximum value is the configured and running value there. I do not need to reconfigure because I already have it is running. Let's just prove that max-stop hints don't force parallelism. I am saying option max-stop 8 on this query. I just did Control L, but I have set the cost threshold so high that I do not qualify to go parallel. Just saying max-stop 8 does not force it. What that hint does, this hint says, if I qualify to go parallel and I get a parallel plan, this is how many cores I would like to use. But it doesn't force me to qualify. Cost threshold beats a max stop hint at any time. They just don't mean the same thing. This says, if I get parallelism, what do I do? The cost threshold is who gets to go parallel, and in this case, it isn't me. Same thing for the database level max stop. Using that, I've set the database level max stop to 8. I'm way below my cost threshold for my single threaded plan. I'm not going to get it. So we're going to reset that one too. We can force a parallel plan by using a ridiculous query hint. What I'm going to do here is look in my execution plan cache, or actually no, I could look in my execution. You could get this in a number of ways. You could get this from your execution plan cache. I am looking in Query Store because I have Query Store and pulling out the XML for plans for queries who have this text in the query. Looking at those plans, I do have a number of them. I have multiple query IDs because my query text changed slightly. Query Store looks at the query text, and if you have any different spacing, like these first three look all alike, but this third one, I had some sort of different, maybe a carriage return, or I had different spacing in there that actually caused it to get its own query ID of 100. This last one, I had the index hint in there, which is counted as part of the syntax. I have multiple queries and multiple plans. I want the parallel plan for query 18, which if we click on that first one, that is my parallel plan. This is a plan in Query Store, so it does not, notice there's no, I know it's parallel, but there's not, any actual DOP info. This is not an actual plan. This is a Query Store plan that could be, reused for different purposes. The data might have changed between different executions, et cetera, et cetera. So what I want for this plan, I'm going to right click. I'm going to say show execution plan XML. What I'm going to do is grab the XML and use this XML as a query hint, which is a big query hint. Right click, show XML. We have to take this out. So I'm going to do Control A and copy it. And what we end up doing, I'm in the wrong file. We want to be in O3. Let's drag O3 over in here. We'll pin it. So it's now my default file up there. Now that I have the XML, I'm going to paste it into this plan. And we actually want to run this for first name equals Jacob. So I'm going to make that Jacob. And it's not a very elegant solution here. I'm going to get rid of what I have before. I do have a cake that's been previously baked in the oven here, just like they do on the food shows. I'm going to delete that and paste in my XML. And notice that I've got some problems in here. There are in the plan some things that use single quotes. If I try to use this like it is now, I'm going to get a big old error that says, I don't know what you mean. I'm just going to do Control L there, and it gives me a syntax error. And that is because those quotation marks have not been escaped. I need to highlight this whole thing. And in different plans, sometimes I have different numbers of escaping I have to do. I'm going to replace single quotation marks with double in the selection. Replace all. And now, notice that the coloring is not, now it's properly escaped. Now, if I go back up, highlight my query and do Control L, it will compile now that I have escaped. And that's why I'm like, this is kind of icky. But what I have essentially done is I have hinted, use this execution plan, and then given it, whoops, I don't want to do that. Use this execution plan, and then given it an entire execution plan, which hopefully I, type everything right. You know what I mean? This is somewhat flexible because let's change this to Mr. Let's, I have changed a little bit of my query, just the values inside that literal there. If I do Control L now, it can still, even though I changed the value from Jacob to Mr., that change is sufficient. My query will still work. And if I get my plans on, or get my actual execution plans on, I do use the plan that I hinted. Looking at my properties here, my query properties, and if we highlight even the tooltip here, notice that use plan does show up as part of the statement because it is part of the statement. We can see a property on our select, use plan equals true. I was forced to use this plan, in this case, by a use plan hint. My query was, the cost was under the cost threshold. I have the cost threshold set at the maximum. The estimated cost to run this query is, even at maxed up 1, is well under it. But by forcing it to use a plan, by hinting the plan, I have overridden and that SP configure setting for the cost threshold. The number of number of processors that I used, we are at degree of parallelism equals 5. And that is what we set at the top for our instance level setting. The database scoped configuration was 8. We did that for the instance setting. All right, so we can get around it. This is one of the less simple ways to do it. Query Store is much easier. I don't have to do any complicated plan copying and escaping of things. In Query Store, I once again am going to look at the queries that I have. If I want to say, for query ID 18, I want you to use plan 24. Let's look at this line. I'm going to click on the plan. This plan is the parallel plan. It has all of my parallel operators. For this query, there's also plan ID 114. If I look at the plan XML, that is my single threaded plan. I do not want that plan. And currently, if I look at my current estimated plan, just to make sure, the one that doesn't have any query hints on it. Yep, I'm getting the single threaded plan. Well, with Query Store, it's very simple to say use the parallel plan, as long as Query Store has the parallel plan in there. And this would happen if I raised my cost threshold, right? If a query was going parallel before I raised my cost threshold and then I raise it, as long as my retention policies on Query Store haven't gotten rid of that plan, I am still going to have a history of that plan in there. I can say for query ID 18, I want you to force plan ID 24. Question, can you explain the difference between the query ID and the plan ID? For Query Store, it identifies things at the query level. So even if you use a stored procedure, if it has multiple queries in it, it will get a query ID for each individual query in there. And it uses the string of the query to determine, is this a query I've seen before? We can see how many times these queries have run as well. Query ID 18 here, these two have the exact same query text as one another. So when I run the query again and again, if it is the exact same query text, including spaces and things like carriage returns at the end, characters I may not be able to see in this view, it will say, oh, I've seen that query before. Sometimes the same query may get a different execution plan. In this case, this first execution plan was parallel. This second execution plan was single threaded, and that was because of the cost threshold differences. So the same query can have multiple plans over time. Other things could cause it to have different plans as well, especially if it's parameterized. It might get different plans depending on different compiles that it has. This query has some sort of probably a carriage return at the end that we can't see in this view that made it get recognized as a different query ID. So, and it has one plan in cache for that query. That plan is a parallel plan. This can get a little tricky if we are testing things with T-SQL, because we want to make sure that, we always highlight the exact same amount of the query so that it actually will match up. So I don't know that I've run this. Let's run our plan forcing. Yes, I hadn't run this. I'm now saying if for query ID equals 18, whenever you see that, use plan ID 24, which is the parallel plan. Now that I have done that, I'm going to do Control L against my query. And when I do estimated plan for my query, it doesn't look like, okay, I froze the parallel plan, but it doesn't look like I'm going to get it. I get the single threaded plan. Well, that was the plan that was in cache. I've now started executing the query, and the actual plan I get is the parallel plan. This is just a little oddity with Query Store. When you're first testing after forcing a query, estimated plans will just look at if you have a plan in memory in the cache, estimated plan will just show you that plan. It won't go through the steps of like, is Query Store going to force a plan? It's only when you actually execute the query that it checks and it says, oh, does Query Store for this exact text? And this is part of why I put the go here, is so that I always get the same text. Apparently, I bet once I highlighted like this and I didn't get a little space or a carriage return after it, and that's why I got a separate query ID. But when I actually executed it, it goes and it looks, do I have an exact text match for this in Query Store? If so, it will replace the plan in cache with the forced plan. Now, after it's actually run once and changed the plan in cache, if I do Control L, I see the parallel plan. But yeah, so if you're forcing plans in Query Store, don't rely on estimated plan right after you force it to tell you what the plan's going to be. You need to actually either run it or somebody else needs to run it to have the forcing go into effect. I can tell that this has been forced in Query Store in a couple different ways. There's dynamic management views that will tell me, hey, this is forced in Query Store. In my plan properties, I once again see used plan equals true. I have said, hey, you need to force this plan in Query Store. There's also, it's real easy. There's if I go into the database and into Query Store, when you enable Query Store, this will appear after it's enabled. If I want to see queries who have forced plans, it will query the dynamic management views for me. And we got a little strange, there we go, a little strange alignment there after doing it. I have one forced plan. I can see information on its execution history and the multiple plans that it has. This is simply query ID 18 that is showing up here. I can see all the plans that it's had, along with, right now it's doing its average. I think we're doing average duration is I think what we're showing here. We can reconfigure that anytime we want. If we wanted to do CPU time, we could do that. So I could do average CPU time like so. And then I can see both of the plans at the bottom. So here is the single threaded plan. That's the purple one. It has a higher average CPU time. Here is plan ID 24. It is much lower. I can also unforce by using this button here, or behind the scenes, it's simply running. There we go. Let's get right back to the right one. It is simply running SP Query Store unforced plan. So if I want to use a change request to force and unforce plans, I can easily write T-SQL to force the plan or unforce it. I do need to make sure to use the right query ID when I'm unforcing this, or I will not successfully unforce the query. I am unforcing plan 24 for query ID 18. Yes, I do have to specify both. Currently, you can only force one plan for a query ID, so why should I have to specify the plan ID? I have hope that maybe we will have more complex ability to force. I mean, I hope this means in the future we might be able to force more than one plan for a query. So maybe we could say, in certain situations, use this plan, in other situations, use the other. I don't know. All I know is we have to specify both to unforce. Now that it is unforced, again, looking at estimated plan, that was Control L, it's just going to look at what's in cache. What's in cache right now is the parallel plan, which I had forced before, but it's no longer forced before. It is no longer forced. If I execute this query right now, it is going to, when it executed, check, is Query Store forcing a plan? No, Query Store is not forcing a plan. I should get a single threaded plan. Oh, the one in cache isn't a single threaded plan. Well, I'm going to get rid of the one in cache. Now I'm back to single threaded, which we can tell by the fact that this has now taken 18 seconds. So it will take 47 seconds for this to complete if we allow it. But there are more ways. Maybe you don't have Query Store. If you have Query Store, I do think this is the easiest process to use. Before, if you raise cost threshold and you do identify, hey, I've got a couple queries who they aren't going parallel and I want them to, but it's just a couple. It's not enough. I don't. If it's a ton of queries, you may want to revert the change. But if it's just a couple, you might consider forcing the plans in here and then maybe rewriting the queries. I would do a longer thing of figuring out why are these costs estimating, are the costs estimating too low? But as a short-term measure, you could use Query Store to manually force the plan, and it's quite simple and easy to do so. You can even use the GUI it provides in the report. But what if I don't have Query Store? Not running on SQL Server 2016. You can use plan guides. This is easier than the use hint option, but doing basically the same thing. I don't have to format an entire execution plan. What I can do is look in the cache of my SQL Server and say, do you have a plan, a parallel plan for this query in memory? And if you don't have a parallel plan in memory, there is a way to force it that we'll look up to. But is there a parallel plan in memory? In this case, I do not have a parallel plan in memory right now. And that is because I executed the query single threaded and it replaced the plan in cache. Actually, I'm surprised I'm not seeing the single threaded plan in cache. I wonder if it is due to the fact that I canceled that execution. Let's see. So I did run this with Jacob, fn first name equals Jacob. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to cheat a little bit and we're going to scroll down. So let's say the plan isn't in cache, which in this case it's not. There are ways that we can get the plan into cache with a parallel plan. They are undocumented and they are unsupported though. So you're doing something risky if you use these. I would not want to leave these hints in production code. One hint that we can use is option use hint enable parallel plan preference. This was introduced in 2016 Service Pack 1 cumulative update 2. but it is not documented. It is not supported. The syntax for this is option use hint, enable parallel plan preference. If we look at the dynamic management view that tells us what are the valid hints we can use, notice that enable parallel plan preference, not in this list, not supported by Microsoft. But this could be useful if I just wanted to know, hey, how would you perform if you went parallel? Give me a rough idea. Essentially what this hint does is say, ignore cost threshold for parallelism. It's not going to guarantee that I go parallel. There might be things that prevent my query from going parallel, which we'll talk about. There might be inhibitors or reasons it doesn't go parallel, but it's going to say, ignore the cost. So the threshold is not going to prevent me from going parallel. Something else still might. But looking at estimated plan for this, yep, even though cost threshold is super high, I'm getting a parallel plan. I can execute this and get a parallel plan. And hey, my query is much faster than MaxStop1 there. And my estimated query cost is 503.801. There may be little differences between the cost here and the cost you would see without the hint, by the way. That could happen, but now when I look at my plan who's in the cache, can we find our plan in the cache? Notice one thing about this plan. Scroll. The text for my query includes the hint. A lot of our, if I freeze the plan for this query in cache, it is going to freeze it, but it's going to freeze it for the plan, for the query who has option use hint enable parallel plan preference. I want a query to go parallel that doesn't have this hint on it. So this is good for testing, but I don't really want to use it in production code because it's not supported. And it is changing my query text, which is kind of a bummer. If I, like, for Query Store, for example, really cares about what the query text is. All right, well, there is another way we can say, there's an equivalent to this that doesn't require a query hint. Before we ever had enable parallel plan preference, we had trace flag 8649. I am enabling this just for my session. I've said dbcc trace on 8649 and 0. If I look at dbcc trace status, I do have to have sysadmin permissions to turn trace flags on and off, but I have enabled this only for my session. This says ignore the cost threshold for parallelism setting for my session. That means I can run this query without changing the query text. I can do estimated plan for it. Estimated plan is not going parallel, but if I do actual plan and run the query, come on. Oh, interesting. We are at 7. We are at 8. What went wrong? Interesting. Let's stop the execution for this. So I ran dbcc trace on 8649. Undocumented trace flag fun. This is on for my session. Let's double check to see if I have properly I should have unforced my plan there. Okay, let's close some things out. I haven't created a plan guide yet. I'm like, what things could I have done to mess myself up at this point? All right, this should be showing me, yeah, we do not have any forced plans in Query Store. So we did properly unforce the plan. Interesting. Yeah, we have not created that plan guide. dbcc trace on 8649, that is on. We are on for our session. Well, I cannot explain to you why my estimated plan is showing. That is odd. So I did run the command to drop the plan guide, but there's no plan guide to drop. Other than that, I just looked at Query Store and saw that we had no query plan. Now, when I do estimated plan for this, it is doing what I would have expected it to do the first time and following the trace flag. Let's execute it actually, and it used the parallel plan. I cannot explain why on my first run of this, it went single threaded and didn't honor the trace flag. I may be able to review the video and see something I did that would explain it, but I actually, and when I've done this before, it has right away taken effect for my session. Like I haven't had to like wait 15 seconds for it to do this. When I've done this demo before, it kicks in right away. And I am suspicious that it's me, but also it's an undocumented trace flag. So there could be some weird thing where sometimes it doesn't take effect right away. So that is interesting. But what I essentially have done is, with some confusion, I have used this trace flag to execute the query and cached the execution plan for the parallel query. It's been seen and recorded by Query Store. It has been seen and recorded by in the execution plan cache as well. And just, I'm going to try to highlight very carefully there and only do from the select to the go so that the plan that is in cache matches the syntax. I don't want extra space before the query. And are you going single threaded now? We're at 12 seconds. We're at 13 seconds. I'm going to open another window and I'm running SP who's active, which it looks like I haven't installed at this point. Yes, I apparently have not installed SP who's active properly. Maybe I did maybe I have a caps issue on that. That's interesting. But I think it is running single threaded this time. Let's retest. All right, so in the current situation, if I do Control L here, with exactly that highlighted, I get single threaded. If I highlight the space before it, we have now determined that is very odd. If I include the space before it, I'm getting the parallel plan. And if I execute it with the parallel plan. And the plan is not being forced. Like, right, if I click select, there's no use plan equals true here, which is just showing, hey, there's no like plan guide or queries. Nothing is forcing this to use the plan. If I simply highlight from this to go, I get the single threaded plan. Well, what if I get rid of that space and can't have a space? Single threaded, what if I don't highlight the go? Parallel. Undocumented trace flag fun. This is what you get with undocumented things, is you get real weirdness. So I'm going to highlight. This is so strange. I am delighted by the strangeness of this. This is bizarre. Well, my estimated cost is 503.81. Now that I've gotten the parallel plan in cache, we're going to see if we can force this. So weird, SQL Server. I can even, before I force it, I can even disable the trace flag in my session. The important thing is that there is a parallel plan in cache that I can freeze. This is super reliable. Now I'm running the query that's looking in the execution plan cache, and notice that it does care about spaces. These are two separate queries. I would expect them to also have separate query IDs in Query Store. We could check. There sometimes is differences between the query cache and Query Store, but I'm going to take this one who doesn't have a space in front of it, and I want the plan handle for it. Let's look at the plan. It is a parallel plan. I am going to freeze this plan. I'm going to plug my plan handle in here, and I'm running a procedure named SP create plan guide from handle. And what it does is it looks in my execution plan cache, it finds that plan, and it just says, okay, we're going to freeze that. So every time you see the query that matches the text in cache, which would be, spacing matters, things like that matter. Whenever you see that query, I want you to use the plan I've frozen in cache. It will survive restarts, just like Query Store. It will survive failovers and things like that. It does not get unset when our SQL Server starts. So our query, still under the cost threshold for parallelism. If I do estimated plan, I am seeing single threaded. Now, with our spacing issues, I am wondering which plan am I actually going to get? Yeah, we have gotten the single threaded plan. Let's stop this. Let's put a space in there. Let's look at X. Yes. So I have to have a space in front of it to get the parallel plan for it to match. If I do match exactly, this is so goofy. When my plan freezes, just like Query Store, this is also true for Query Store. It's also true if you have hinted a plan, the plan properties will have use plan equals true. I think it is very clear now that the method with Query Store is much easier because I didn't have to worry about nearly as much when freezing the plan in Query Store. Oh my goodness, this is bonkers that that trace flag cared about that space. I do not even know what to think about that, but I'm definitely going to see if I can reproduce it after re-restoring the database and blog about it, because that's just wacky. But the fact that it is an unsupported trace flag kind of means nobody's going to care about it, right? So quirks and all. But I have disabled that. So this just means that life can be pretty complicated if I don't have query store. And to be honest, I don't get excited about freezing plans with plan guides at all. You know, it strikes me, it's something that can work sometimes, but I would rather tune the query if I need to. The main reason I would use these tools, so Martin has a question. Will a plan ever get automatically unforced from query store? Kind of. You might have query store shut off on you. Your query store might become unoperational for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's due to pressure, or maybe it runs out of space, or things like that. So the plan forcing might stop working because query store stopped working. My understanding is that if you have forced a plan, it will not get aged out. You know, it will be retained even if the query hasn't been run in a long time. I have not tested that recently, and I would like to test that though. But I believe that the main things are that maybe query store just stops being functional for some reason. If you're using automatic tuning, there is, if you are not manually forcing the plan, but you are letting SQL Server automatically tune and sometimes force the plan, those will dynamically become unforced. This is specifically manually forced plans should stick around when query store is operational. It will only work on the primary if you're using secondaries. And I believe that this has been blogged. Let's double check that one. I think Aaron has blogged about this one. So query store, availability groups. It might be Grant who blogged about it. Secondary forced plan. I believe it does not work on. Oh, it was Joey who did it. So Joey D'Antoni. It looks like Aaron has also blogged this as well, and there's a Microsoft blog as well. But this is, even if you have forced a plan on the primary, it really doesn't, it does not force plans, nor does it record any of your data. Oh, and he worked with Grant and Aaron on this as well. So let me throw this post into the lesson as well. So it might just not work if you're looking at it on a secondary database, which is kind of a bummer. That is something that Microsoft has told us is on the roadmap, is to, in some way, get a story for query store for secondaries. Alrighty. We have 90 minutes to finish. I'm a little behind schedule, so I may speed up. Hence, the main reason I think these are important to know is that this can be good for testing. Sometimes if I'm testing and I'm just not getting a parallel plan, I'm like, oh, what would you be like if you were parallel? I might just use this hint as long as it's safe for me to execute the query there. I might just use this hint. I can only use it in 2016 SP1CU2, so this trace flag can be useful in other versions. It does, of course, change your query text. I like these for testing. I can use them, as we saw, I can use them to inject a parallel plan into cache or query store. And I do want to, on this one, I want to unbullet that item. I could theoretically use either of these to inject a parallel plan into cache. It's actually most useful for the trace flag here, if done at a session level setting. So actually, let's give it its own bullet there. That's fine. Query store is my favorite. One of the things about query store is that when we force a plan, there is a little wiggle room when it runs. It could adjust how much memory grant it gets. It's not forcing everything about the plan. It's forcing, I like to think of it as it forces the plan shape with properties like parallelism. So it is a nice short-term fix. Of course, we could hint an entire query plan. We could use SP create plan guide in 2008 and higher. Kind of a pain to get it to work. Freezing these plans, I have done it in the past, and it has been good for a short-term fix. Query text must match exactly, just like query store. Is it worth it to force parallelism for a query? Sometimes. It is a lot of work if you don't have query store. Well, it's a lot of work if you don't have query store. It may not be a lot of work if you have query store. I typically would consider it a short-term fix. If I am having to freeze a plan, whether it's with query store or something else, I don't really want to freeze the plan because in 2 years, the data may have changed. My SQL Server version may have changed. Is that still the best plan? Well, how would I know? I would have to unforce it and then test. I like to use forcing plans as a short-term fix and then figure out, okay, how can I rewrite the query or change my indexes so that I don't have to force the plan and SQL Server just gets it right away. But that usually is a greater risk and a more long-term fix than just forcing the plan.